Hello students, today we're going to be talking about MLA indirect sources. This is Professor Pell from Wilbur Wright College, the City Colleges of Chicago. In this presentation, I'm going to give you an analogy about airplane flights to help you understand the material. Then I'll be talking about direct sources versus indirect sources. We'll be talking then about indirect source quotation sandwiches. Then we'll talk about indirect source quotation practice, and then we'll have a little review session. So first, let's talk about this analogy to airline flights. So imagine for a moment that you're in Seattle and that you want to fly to Chicago. Now, if you were to book a flight and go directly from Seattle to Chicago without any stops and without the plane landing, that would be considered a direct flight. Now, let's say you're in Seattle and you want to go to Chicago, but the only flights available route you through San Diego. That would be an indirect flight because you're stopping along the way before you get to your destination. This is important to remember and to use to help you understand when we're talking about indirect sources that you might be using to quote in your papers. So what are direct and indirect sources? A direct source is where your student writing takes the words directly from the author of a text. The person that you're quoting in your own essay or your own writing is the author of the text. This is the person that you would find listed on your works cited page or your references page. So those two would correlate. So if the author's words are and the author's texts are what you're quoting and putting into your student writing, that would be direct. Here's an example from a recent New York Times article. This article is Los Angeles Puts $100 Million into Helping the Homeless by Jennifer Medina. This was in the September 22nd, 2015 New York Times online edition. So when we look at this article, my question for you is what material would be a direct source? Take a moment to read through this article and see if you can identify what passages would be direct. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, so now let me show you which areas would be direct source. Essentially, it's anything that's not already in quotation marks or already a paraphrase from another person or institution. So this whole first paragraph would be a direct source. If you wanted to quote anything from there, it would be directly from Medina. Then in the next paragraph, only part of it would be directly from Medina because these are her words that she's reporting. And then in the last paragraph here, these are the only words in that paragraph that are Medina's. So any of these things would be up to grabs as a direct source. Now, sometimes you might want to quote somebody else that is not the author of a text. An example might be a reporter who interviewed someone else and put that interview in their article, or a statistic that a writer might give you that he or she didn't calculate on his or her own. And sometimes when you do quote someone who the author has quoted or paraphrased, that's when it is called an indirect quote. So let's say here's your student writing, and you want to quote someone that the author has paraphrased, someone other than the author, his or herself. But you have to get it through the author's text because the person you want to quote didn't actually write an article or a book or something like that. In this instance, if you want to go from the quote of someone who didn't write a book or an article and you want to put that in your student writing, you have to go through the author who wrote the book or the article, and that's considered indirect. So when we look back at this Medina article, what material here would be for an indirect source? Again, it would be anything that is quoted or paraphrased. So anything that is not Medina's own words or her own ideas. So the first thing would be this paraphrase where she's mentioning what national experts say and they're giving a statistic. The next would be where the mayor and the city council have pledged this information. She's paraphrasing what they have said rather than just reporting upon it. She's using a paraphrase. Then in this last paragraph, we've got a direct quote by the mayor of LA. That would be an indirect source. So if you wanted to quote directly what the author said or the mayor said, you can go ahead and do that, but you would just have to set it up as an indirect source because the mayor did not, in fact, write this article. The mayor would not have a listing on your works cited page. So when you're setting up an indirect source, you must show who said the quote or paraphrase. Usually the best way to do this is to mention them in a signal phrase. You also must show where you found the quote. You must give the author of the text where you found it. This will allow your reader to find where the quote would be on your works cited page. Because again, in this example that we just looked at, the mayor didn't write the article. The mayors are often not writing anything. It's the reporters who are writing something. So if you don't go to the presentation to hear the mayor directly, then you, as the student writer, have to use the newspaper article or whatever source using the setup for an indirect source. So when you do this, the parenthetical citation in the text of your essay will begin with the abbreviation QTD period and then the word in. That's short for quoted in, followed by the author of the article or whatever's listed first on your works cited page. So here are some examples. If you're citing an indirect quote, it might look something like this. Mayor Eric Garcetti states, quote, "Every single day we come to work, we see folks lying on this grass, a symbol of our city's intense crisis." End quote. Now you notice here that we've introduced who's about to be speaking the quote, then we've given the quote, and then we use the abbreviation quoted in Medina, because Medina is the author of the article where we found this quote. Medina would be who is listed on the works cited page at the end of our essay. Now, if we wanted to do a paraphrase with an indirect source, it would look something like this. Official experts on homelessness suggest more than 26,000 people are homeless in Los Angeles. Okay, because Medina cited this as a paraphrase herself, I'm choosing just to re-paraphrase it in my own words. I'm using a similar signal phrase, experts on homelessness, that Medina used because she wasn't very specific in giving credit to these individuals. Then I give the statistic that she gives, and then I use the abbreviation quoted in Medina. The abbreviation that you use in your parenthetical citation is no different whether or not you're quoting a direct quote or a paraphrase. They both are quoted in. The abbreviation QTD period, the word in, and then the author's name. Okay, so the quotation sandwich for indirect sources, let's look at that. As a review, for your quotation sandwich, you need to introduce the quote with a signal phrase. That's like your top piece of bread. Then you give the quote. That's like all the good stuff in the middle of a sandwich. And then you explain the quote. That's like the bottom piece of bread. This structure is there because it holds things together very nicely and allows you to let your quote seamlessly flow in your paper. So the indirect quotation sandwich. Here's an example. In talking about the landscape of Anaheim, Carl Karcher states, "This would be my introduction to the quote. I've named who said what I'm about to say. Then I'm going to give the quote. Quote, "This is heaven." You notice I've given the quote here. Then I'm giving the abbreviation quoted in, and then I'm giving the author's name where I found this particular quote. Because Carl Karcher did not write any book, I have to reference the author where I found this quote. And that author in this case is Eric Schlosser. Eric Schlosser would be on my works cited page at the end of my paper. Then I'm going to explain the quote. This is clearly ironic because he later explains that he didn't see the loss of the Southern paradise to roads and subdivisions as being problematic. You notice here that I'm about to explain why I've used this quote and what it means in the context of my paper. So some things that you want to do when using an indirect source. You want to name who said the quote in a signal phrase. That's really important. You want to use quotation marks around the quote itself. You want to use a space after the quotation mark. Then you want to begin the parenthetical citation, your parenthetical reference. You'll include the abbreviation quoted in and the author's last name where you found the quote. You'll include the page number if it's applicable. Like with the online source that I showed you, there was no page number because we don't use page numbers with online sources. Then you would end the parentheses, and then you would be sure to end the sentence where it ends after the parentheses. Remember, you don't want to begin a sentence with a parentheses. Some don'ts about your indirect source quotation sandwich. First, don't name the author in the signal phrase and in the parentheses. So you wouldn't want to say, according to Medina according to the mayor in Medina's article, then give the quote, and then give the parenthetical citation at the end and also name Medina. You don't want to name the author twice. It's just redundant. Then you don't want to use quotation marks around the parentheses. Okay? There are usually no parentheses in your quotes, so don't put the information in quotation marks. Then you don't want to end the sentence before it's over. The period goes after the citation, not before. You don't want to begin a sentence with a parentheses. Also, don't forget your author and your source in the indirect source quotation sandwiches. If you're going to quote or paraphrase from an indirect source, you need to name both who said the quote and the reference where you found that quote. It's very important. So why don't you take a moment to pause this video and we'll practice a little bit. Find a passage from a text that we've been using in class and try to find an indirect source. Then compose an indirect source quotation sandwich and do that twice for practice. And pause the video now. Okay, now here's our classroom assessment technique. Our review. Here are the questions. Question 1, what is a direct source? Question 2, what is an indirect source? Question 3, what parts do you need for a quotation sandwich? Question 4, what things do you need in your parenthetical citation for an indirect source? Question 5, what things should you not do when quoting an indirect source? So pause this presentation now, and when you come back, the answers will be there for you. Okay, thank you for joining us today, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me.